Okay, good afternoon. For some reason, Zoom isn't allowing me to schedule meetings, so that's why we're doing it slightly differently today. Anyway, let's carry on anyway. So essentially today, I want to just give you an intro to the spec for the second assignment. But before I do that, what I want to do is just do a quick comparison between the lab that you worked on last week. So last week you worked on the CI/CD lab for the Movies API, and I gave you the starting kind of code base, which was a version of the Movies API that we used last year. Slightly early, slightly incomplete version of it, but nevertheless, what was there was working, so to speak. Now, I've gotten a copy from Roseanne of the status of the web API that she has been working on with G in her labs. I got a copy of it there this morning, and there are some slight differences in the structure of the code base. I just want to quickly do a compare and contrast between what you're working on in the Web App Dev 2 module, and compare that in terms of the Web API now, and compare it to what I gave you last week as the starting point for last week's lab. Can I just check people can hear me okay?
Yeah, I can hear you.
Okay, good. So what you're looking at is my VS Code, and I have two windows open. The window that you're looking at now is essentially the code that I gave you as a starting point last week. And this window is a copy essentially of Roseanne's GitHub repo that she's maintaining as she works her way through the web API on her module. So maybe if I look at this first, and if we take it from the top down, well, the very first thing, which isn't that relevant really, is, okay, we need to go into the Movies API subfolder. That's okay. We need to worry about that. So if we start from here, so we've got the API folder, and that has a Movies and Users subfolder, and it has these two extra files. Extra file for talking directly to TMDB. I think that's what it does. I didn't look at it actually. Is that what it's doing? I didn't look at it. Fetch. Okay, I'm not going to spend time looking at it, but so, and if we drill down, I'm just going to close that off. If we go into the Movies subfolder and then into the index.js, this is where we can see the various endpoints related to movies. So we've got a get to the root and a get to /ID. And we've also got a get to, get to TMDB. Okay, so I presume this endpoint is actually using the other file that I just opened there. That's fine. So that's what you have developed so far in the web app dev module. And if I flip over to what I gave you last week, before I move away from this, so there's pagination brought into this, as you know. So that's complicated it a little bit, but it's really nice, that pagination stuff though. If I go over to what I gave you last week, and go into the API folder and the Movies folder and into here, Well, okay, I've also got this get to the root, but I don't have any pagination in the version that I gave you, whereas you do have pagination. So that's going to affect the tests that we wrote for this particular endpoint. Those tests are going to have to change, and that's part of what you will be doing in the assignment for me. This one is pretty much the same, I think. I get to, you don't have this endpoint at all. This wasn't developed in the web app dev, but you might consider bringing it into the web app dev. It's up to you. And this endpoint equally is not in the web app dev, but you could bring it into the web app dev. And also, presumably, you would be storing your reviews in your Mongo database. And then you would have tests associated with that from my side. So there are some differences there. The main one is what you've got in web app dev for this endpoint is much more sophisticated than what I'm showing you here. And there's the other slight differences as well. If I go into users, I'd say users is pretty much the same. There isn't a whole lot of difference between the users that I gave you and the users that you have developed for yourselves this year. I haven't looked at them actually, but it's fairly minimal, I'd say. There's a post which handles both registration and login. And then there are some convenience functions as well. So that's what you have in the web app dev. On my side, there's also there's a get here for get all users, but that's not really that much use. This is the post for registration and login, and that's fine. This looks like it handles the ability to update a user. That's probably not too interesting. Get /username/favorites. Okay, that's something we worked on last week. Excuse me. So, in the web app dev module, maybe for that is the assignment and that, although I'm not preempting now what Rosanna is going to ask you to do, but you could have an endpoint that allows you to save your favorites into the Mongo database and save them via the web API. What this is actually doing is it's returning somebody's favorites based on their name. So that's probably not something that you would want to develop in the web app dev. You'd certainly want to be able to save your own favorites into your Mongo database and retrieve them as well. But there are some slight differences there, it seems. Okay, that's users. There's no genres. You didn't go near genres. And indeed, the genres that I have here doesn't involve using MongoDB at all. So we can kind of ignore that. I don't think there's genres, is there? Let me see. Movies, users, and no, there's no genre so far anyway. Okay, moving on. So that's the API side. So there are some changes there, and those changes will impact on the tests that we developed last week. You're going to have to make some changes to those tests so that they work with the new version of the web API, because it is the new version of the web API. In other words, the version that you're developing in web app dev, that's the version that you will need to include in the submission for me. So the tests will have to be against that version of the web API, not the version of the web API that I gave you in last week's lab. And that's part of the assignment for me, really. In the authentication side, there are no differences there, really, or very little anyway, between what I showed you last week and what you've developed. So we need to drill down into that. The DB folder from that you developed in Web App Dev is pretty much the same as the DB folder that we had in my assignment, my lab last week. So that's pretty much the same. The error handler folder, the code in there, we didn't have an error handler folder in what I gave you last week. So that's a slight difference. I think the error handling code was actually in what I gave you last week. The error handling code was built into the base index.js, but I'd have to look at that to confirm that really. And moving on down, the initialize dev, that's a completely new folder, but it kind of essentially does the same as the seed DB folder that we had from last week. There are some differences though. For example, if we look at what you've done in Web App Dev, and you're essentially using you're using the node env environment variable to control whether you seed the database or not. Whereas if you remember in the code that I gave you last week, we were using an environment variable called that we called CDB. Where did we use it? If we go in here, we had a CDB environment variable that we used to control whether we seeded the database or not. So there's just slight differences, but they kind of have the same net effect. Although we need to look at how we can accommodate the initialize dev into what we produced in last week's lab. So anyway, there's a difference there. Anyway, that's all I'm highlighting for now. The environment variable file that I have here, I just copy that over from what I gave you last week. But if I open it up, you see we've got this CDB now, which is not being used by this code here at all. It's using the node env to determine whether a database should be seeded or not. So I need to see what the impact of that is in terms of what you produced in last week's lab. And finally, we have the index.js at the very top. Where is that? Here we are. There are some slight differences as well between this, what you're looking at there now, and the index.js that I gave you last week, although I think they're pretty minor. So what point am I trying to make? The point I'm trying to make is that if you take if you take last week's lab, you're going to have to make some changes to the folder structure and the contents of some of the folders in order to get it aligned with the web API that you are developing in the Web App Dev module. Now, I will look at that as well, and I will give you some direction along those lines, but I haven't had a chance to look at it this morning, and I don't think I'll get a chance to look at it before tomorrow morning's lab, because I've only gotten my hands on this code which you've developed in the Web App Dev module. I've only got my hands on it this morning, so, and I've been just looking at I've been comparing and contrasting the two. And so there are some differences that we need to see how can we kind of stitch in those differences into what you worked on in my lab last week. I'll just pause for a second in case there's anything that I'm not making clear, even though I'm only giving you kind of overview stuff. What I'd still like to do in terms of the second assignment for me of the Agile module, I'd still like you to use the project that you worked on in last week's lab. I'd still like you to use that as your starting point. Now we're going to have to make some changes by adding some folders, changing some files. But once we've done that and everything is still working again, then that's your starting point, that's your launching pad for my second assignment. But getting to that stage will involve a little bit of copying files and making slight changes to other files before we get to that point. So I'm assuming now everybody successfully completed last week's lab and they were able to run the CI/CD pipeline on GitLab for the source code that we had last week. But now we're going to go making some changes to the source code. And we want to get our CI/CD pipeline working again. Okay, so that's the challenge that we just need to overcome. But as I said, I will look at it myself first. So maybe you can certainly have a poke around, but don't make any kind of major changes to the lab that you worked on last week. Just let me have a look at it first, maybe. Right. So at that stage, we will then have, once we've made the necessary changes to the project that you worked on in last week's lab for me, and everything is back up and running again, that's your starting point for my second assignment. So what's required in the second assignment? And so I've updated the specification. And so if I go in here, no major changes really. Okay, so the overall objective is to produce a CI/CD pipeline for a web API. Nothing new there. The only, you needn't be worried about this. I just put that section in for the purpose of our external examiners. So that's not important. The completion date I'm setting as the 2nd of January. Guess you should really try and get it done before December 25th, though, because it's very difficult to come back to these things after the Christmas period. It's worth 40%, that's fine. The deliverables are fairly straightforward as well. There will be a README that you need to, so it'll be your GitLab repo that I will be looking at, and there's a README that you will need to complete, and I will give you a template for that later on. As always, you must maintain a Git history as you work your way through this. So I shouldn't need to make that point anymore, really. In terms of my grading spectrum, I guess, so in the 40 to 55 bracket, really what I'm looking for is that you have, you've got all of the tests for all of the features that were developed in the web app dev module, all of the API features. You've got good or satisfactory tests for all of those features, because there is some development work in terms of developing the tests required, because I just showed you there, for example, the get all movies has pagination built into it now, and we didn't really test for pagination in the test that we had last week. So you're going to have to get that working, fully tested. Also, you will be adding some new endpoints to your web API for the second assignment in that module. And those new endpoints, clearly, they need to be tested as well. So you need to develop some tests for new API endpoints. And so that's essentially kind of what I'm saying here. The API's new and existing endpoints should be tested satisfactory. There should be satisfactory automated tests for them. So there's no surprise there really. Adherence to testing principles. Well, don't have lots of unnecessary console.logs scattered through your tests. You may well need to use console.logs as you're trying to debug your tests, but certainly you should delete all of those and don't just comment them out. I want the code deleted. I don't want lots of commented out code appearing in any of your test scripts. Clean out all of that stuff. And as well, the other kind of basic testing principles, but the silent principle is probably one of the main ones for this grading standard. On the CI/CD side, well, I mean, you really have that at this stage. The GitLab YAML file that I gave you in last week's lab, that really satisfies the CI/CD requirements for this grade band. But just make sure that it's working, because we will have made changes to the source code, so you need to get all of that kind of working again. But off the top of my head, I can't see that it will be necessary to make any changes to the YAML file. But in order to get your tests working again, given that you're going to be making changes to your existing test cases based on the discussion that we just had there at the very beginning, to get the actual pipeline running to completion, and in particular the testing phase running successfully, there will be some work involved in that on your part. So while you have the pipeline, making sure that the pipeline runs completely successfully will involve a little bit of work. On the source code side, the usual things. I want a git log history, and I've just included this, but because some people think that it's not necessary really to do the README file, but it is, and there will be marks awarded for it, although it's fairly minimal. So that's that grade band. The next grade band is in the 55 to 80, so there's quite a chunk of marks going in this grade band. And really, in terms of the testing side, the automated testing side, I'll be looking to see that clearly everybody will have the normal test cases, but I'll be looking to see, have you thought about boundary test cases and error test cases as well? There won't be that many necessarily of boundary and error test cases required, but they're always in there. And so the challenge is identifying cases where you need to do a boundary test and error testing. Clearly, your tests should cover both the authenticated and unauthenticated use cases. And I'll talk a little bit briefly about that at the end, but you would need to have test cases where we're trying to access a particular API endpoint when there is no authentication included in the request. In other words, there's no token included in the request, and the API endpoint doesn't require a token. That's one case. The other case is where you try and test an API endpoint that does require a token, but you try and access it without a token included in the request. That's a very simple example of an error case, obviously, but on the authenticated side, again, for those endpoints that do require authentication, you will need to have a test case which includes a relevant token to signify that the request is from an authenticated user side. In terms of data validation, I am assuming that, you see, you're going to have Mongoose schemas for controlling access to your MongoDB database. Now, where they become really useful is if you've got any kind of post or put requests going to your API endpoint. Now, I've noticed in what you've developed so far in the web app dev module, if I go back to here, and let's say if we go into the movies endpoint, at the moment, you've got all GET requests. That's a GET request. Are we looking at the right one? Yeah. That's another GET request. That's also a GET request and another GET request. So they're all GET requests, but I guess in terms of the, in relation to the web app dev 2 second assignment, there presumably will be opportunities to add some post and maybe even put and maybe even delete endpoints to your to your movies endpoints. Depends really on what you develop for that module second assignment, but somewhere along the lines there should anyway be some post stroke put stroke delete. Whether you will have examples of all of them, it may be unlikely, but certainly post, there should be at least one or maybe a couple of post endpoints in your web API that you develop for the other module. And so what the post request, as you know, you're sending some JSON data, and presumably that JSON data represents an entity that you want to store in your Mongo database. But before it can be stored in the Mongo database, it needs to adhere to the Mongoose schema. And if it doesn't, then Mongoose will throw a validation error. Now, testing that might be is something that you should do, where you would have a test case where the data that you post is all valid, and then certain parts of the data that you post is not valid. And does your web API return an error response, and what's the structure of that response? And can you write the expectation statements in your test to check that the error response is as we expected? So again, that involves a little bit of thought, both from a testing point of view and also in terms of the actual web API itself. But the overall point I'm trying to get at here is that you will need to come up with some examples of a post request as a minimum, whether you're going to have an opportunity for a put is essentially an update, and whether you're going to have an opportunity for, I didn't include delete there actually, but maybe delete should be in there as well. But certainly put and post. Delete doesn't tend to include data with it, but put and post requests always include data with them, and that data is presumably heading for your Mongo database. But before it gets to the database, as I said, it needs to be checked by your Mongoose schemas. And so having test cases where the data that's included with a put and a post is valid and invalid, those two test cases should be covered by your automated testing code. By structure, obviously, the more test cases you have, then, grouping them sensibly using nested describe blocks is something you should look at as well. So that will take up quite a lot of work, getting satisfying the requirements that I've highlighted there. as I said, you may not have a lot of boundary and normal and error cases, but just having one example of each mightn't be great either. Like you need to try and cover as many boundary and error test cases as is required by the web API. So it's going to be very much dictated by what kind of extensions you make to your web API for the Web App Dev 2 module. If you just make loads of get HTTP get extensions, then it's going to be difficult, if not impossible, for you to try and satisfy my requirements, my boundary and error requirements that I'm talking about here. But equally, if all you're doing is adding get requests, get endpoints to your web API, then you're taking a slightly simpler approach to your web API as well. Okay, in terms of CI/CD, I want the pipeline to deal with both continuous delivery and continuous deployment. And maybe I'll come back to that in a second. Well, everybody has the Heroku service working at this stage, so everybody kind of has this box ticked to a degree already. But the continuous delivery, continuous deployment is something that in the lab that I gave you last week, we don't have either. Actually, we don't have continuous delivery or continuous deployment. We only have continuous integration. Maybe I should just flip over to expand on that point. These are the slides that we went through last week. And if I fast forward to here, okay, so I explained this diagram to you last week. And the purpose of the diagram, maybe from my point of view, was contrasting continuous delivery versus continuous deployment. And to repeat the point, the difference is, okay, your pipeline goes through the install, build, and test phases. And then the next phase would be to deploy the API to the staging environment. That should happen automatically. Deployment to the production environment depends on whether you are running the continuous delivery or the continuous deployment forms of the pipeline. If it's the continuous delivery one, then the deployment to the production environment is a manual step. It is a stage in the pipeline. So this deployment is going to be a stage in the pipeline, but it's not an ordinary stage. All of the stages so far in the pipeline were automatic. Once one stage completed successfully, the pipeline automatically ran the next stage. However, the stage in the pipeline that represents deployment to here, that is not going to be an automatic stage. It's going to be a manual stage. Really, there's just one setting that you have to add to the stage definition to make it a manual stage. Excuse me, you're going to have to find out, maybe just do a quick Google search as to how you do that. So the continuous delivery running of this pipeline will automatically deploy to here, but the deployment to here is going to be a manual stage in the pipeline. If you're running the continuous deployment form of this pipeline, then the deployment to here is automatic and the deployment to here is automatic. These are just two separate Heroku apps. You can have any number of Heroku apps in your Heroku account. The fact that you're going to have two Heroku apps, which happen to be hosting the exact same web API, that doesn't matter. Heroku doesn't care about that. But we know that the difference between the two of them is that typically this version of the API is only accessible to the software development team itself, whereas this version of the API is available to the open community or whoever your customers are. Now that manual versus automatic, what I'm showing you in this screenshot is just a screenshot of a pipeline. And how can you determine whether a stage in a pipeline is manual or automatic when you actually just look at this output from the GitLab CI? And if I just zoom into it, you can see this icon here. That's telling me that this stage in the pipeline is a manual one, whereas all of the other ones are automatic. And so the way this pipeline runs is it starts at this stage and runs it automatically. And if it passes, it automatically moves on to the next stage. And if that passes, it automatically moves on to the next one. And if that passes, it then moves to this stage, but it doesn't execute it. It just sets it. It's essentially waiting for a manual intervention. And how do you get this stage to run? You simply, I think you just right click it, and there's an option just to say, run the stage. But it is a manual intervention required in order to run it. So the stage itself, it looks like every other stage, except it has one extra setting, which makes it a manual stage rather than automatic. So that's how you notice stages. And a manual stage can be anywhere in a pipeline. It doesn't have to be the last. It doesn't have to be the last stage in the pipeline. It can be anywhere, and there can be any number of them. So the way you'll know whether your manual stage is working correctly or not is when you actually run the pipeline and it gets to that stage in the pipeline, check to see whether you're getting this little icon appearing when you look at the execution of the pipeline in the GitLab CI user interface. Okay, back to the spec. So I'm saying you need to have continuous delivery and continuous deployment declared in your single pipeline, and you can have both of them in a single pipeline. So how does the pipeline know whether it should be running the continuous delivery one or the continuous deployment one? Well, the answer to that is it will depend on what branch you have pushed to GitLab. And if I just scroll down to here I'm telling you the branching policy that I want you to adhere to. If you do a push to your develop branch on GitLab, that should run the install stage, the build stage, the test stage, the deploy to the staging environment stage, and you have that already. The last stage should be deployment to the production environment, but it needs to be a manual stage. So this manual only applies to our pipeline when we push to the develop branch. Whereas when you push to the main branch, it should run the install stage automatically, build automatically, test automatically, deploy to staging automatically, and deploy to production automatically. Hence, we would refer to this execution of the pipeline as a continuous deployment execution of the pipeline, whereas here we have a continuous delivery execution of our pipeline. Okay, so the pipeline looks like the pipeline is going to have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 different stages to it. That's a hint. Back to here. Right. The next grade band, 80 plus. I'm theming it as independent learning, so you're going to have to do some web searching to satisfy this. So I would have mentioned to you when I was talking about CI/CD, I would have talked about, let's see, well, sorry, no, just rewind a little bit. So in general, when we write automated tests, how do we know whether we've written good tests or not? Okay, all the tests pass, let's say, but that doesn't necessarily mean that they are good tests. Is there any way of measuring how good your tests are? And the answer is yes, there is. So there is a measure called the code coverage measure. And the code coverage measure, what it says is that the amount of your source code, that's the actual application itself now, the amount of the source code that has been exercised when you were running your tests, the better. The more of the source code that has been exercised when you run your tests, the better. If I give you a simple example of good code coverage and bad code coverage in terms of testing, if I go back to here and let's say go into, let's go into movies, maybe no users actually. Right, so we've got this endpoint here that we should write some automated tests for. Now, let's supposing, and there's an if statement here. Well, that's okay. Let's take this if statement here. And you know what the purpose of this if statement is checking to see whether the request is a registration request or whether it's a login request. Now, let's supposing I write some automated tests for this endpoint, but I only write a test for the registration side of it. I don't write any tests for the login side of this endpoint. That means that this line of code and anything that lies behind it will not have been exercised when I run my tests. Only this side of the if statement has been exercised. So from a code coverage point of view, I'm not covering the execution of the line that I've highlighted there. Clearly, your tests should exercise both the true and the false side of this if statement. And if it does that, if your tests do exercise both sides, then you have full, we would say that you have full code coverage of this particular endpoint. You've tested all branches within the actual branches now from a code point of view. There are two, we often use the term branch in relation to an if statement. This is one branch of my if. This is another branch of my if. And if we had nested ifs, then we've got more branches again going on. So we want to cover all of the branches within a particular piece of code. Yeah. And here's another branch. We should also have a test case that makes sure that there is a test for which this statement is actually true, which caused it to go in here. So you would need to think of that as well. I guess that's an example, would be an example of an error. Does it return an error? Yeah, it would be an example of an error test case just for this endpoint alone. And without labeling the point, I guess everybody would think of having a test case for this. And indeed, I guess everybody would think of having a test case for the second case as well, for the login. But would you have thought about having a test case which forced when on executing that test case, it forced the flow of control into the true side of this if statement. And, you know, some people would just overlook that. But by overlooking it, then we're not achieving high code coverage. Now, there are tools out there, though, which will tell you how good your code coverage is, and it's measured in percentage terms. You know, are you getting 100% code coverage? Can be quite difficult to get 100% code coverage for an entire application. Now, clearly, it wouldn't be difficult to get 100% code coverage just for this endpoint here. I've already told you that it looks like we would need 3 test cases. But across an entire application's code base, there are tools that will measure how much code coverage you have achieved for each part of your source code base. And one of those tools, and what they do, these tools, is they generate statistics for you, data for you, in other words, on code coverage. And they even go into the level of detail of telling you where exactly within your source code your tests did not exercise a particular piece of source code. So, for example, if you didn't write a test for which this was true, okay, then the code coverage tools will tell you, well, this particular line of code was never exercised when you ran your tests. It goes down to that level of detail. We needn't worry about or explain how they actually achieve that. So one of the tools that measures code coverage for the JavaScript language is a tool called Istanbul. So it's an NPM tool that you install. And if I just click on that and follow through, takes me to some documentation on it. So you're going to need to read, maybe just do some Google searching. You can start from here if you want to. Do they have a docs? They have a tutorial side of it, or just do some general searching. So the Istanbul tool, you need to bring that into your project and get it working, essentially. Get it working when you run your tests locally first. And what it does is it generates output in the form of HTML. And this is, if you open up the HTML pages that it generates, you'll see something like this. So what this is showing us is it will list all of the files that make up your source code. And it tells you the number of statements, essentially, well, that's close to the number of lines of code, although it measures lines of code as well. Gives you a percentage of how many statements within each of these source code files was exercised when you ran your tests. It also can measure how many branches, that's branches in terms of the code branching that I was talking about there. Gives you a measure of how many branches were exercised, how many functions. So it gives you very detailed breakdown of how good your tests were. You needn't worry about the actual data that it's giving you. All I want you to do is get the Istanbul tool working and generating these reports for you. And if the way it works is these are hyperlinked. So if you click on one of those, then it actually brings you down into the actual corresponding source code file. It shows it to you now in HTML form, and it'll highlight in red the particular part of the file that was not exercised when you ran your tests. And I think it probably puts a green coloring if the corresponding line was exercised. So it serves 2 purposes really. It will help you in trying to ensure that you write as complete a set of test cases as possible. But also, I just want you to get some experience of these code coverage tools that accompany automated testing. So if I go back to my spec, so I'm asking you to try and get this Istanbul tool working for your web API project. And you're going to have to put probably some scripts into the package.json as well, to essentially run. I think the way it works is you're still using Mocha to run your tests, but by including some other options in the Mocha execution, you're telling Istanbul to do some extra work as well as the tests are being executed. You don't really need to know how Istanbul works. You just need to get it working so that it produces the reports for you. And I'm suggesting that you should get this Istanbul code coverage reports, get them working locally first. So you're just generating them manually when you run your tests on your local machine. And once you've achieved that, then look at the possibility of building it into your pipeline. Now, your pipeline, though, is running up in GitLab. So having the reports up in GitLab is not really of any use to anybody. You can't see them because once the pipeline has completed its execution, it essentially deletes all of the it deletes everything after it. So you'll never get access to these code coverage reports. However, there is a web service called the where is it? Let's see, this one here, coveralls. I'm not sure how you pronounce it. Coveralls. This is a web service that you can just register for the service, and it's a free service, provided you don't overuse it. And what the service is for, it's essentially a place where you can publish your code coverage reports. And it works with Istanbul. So the idea is that your pipeline, and presumably this would be in the test stage of your pipeline, you'll be running your tests. You will also be using Istanbul with Mocha to run your tests. Istanbul will generate the code coverage reports, those HTML files. It'll store them on the server up on GitLab, but then you'll have another task within the test stage, which will publish those reports to your account in the coveralls service. And then that means you can now, and anybody else in your software development team, if you had a software development team working with you, could now see the output, the code coverage output reports from an execution of a CI/CD pipeline on your GitLab account. And this is actually one that maybe one of last year's students or an earlier year students managed to get working. So there is a little bit of work getting all of this working, admittedly, which is why there's quite high marks going for it. So provided you understand now in general terms what we're trying to achieve here, if that's the case, then you really do have to spend some time doing some Google searching as to how to get all of this working. But take it in stages. And stage one is get it working on your local machine first. And the way you know it's working is it will add a folder to your project. I've forgotten what the name of the folder is now. Could be coverage, actually. I think it might be coverage folder. And within that coverage folder, there will be a HTML subfolder. And in there, you will find HTML files, which contain, when you display them in a browser, you will see something like, where had I it? Like, this, probably the index.html will produce this, or something one level above it. and it'll all be hyperlinked. And when you navigate around, you'll eventually get down to this level where it'll show you one of your source code files and the degree to which it has been fully covered or not from your test cases. Get all of that working on your local machine, and then start thinking about, well, how can I actually plug it into my CI pipeline and get it to publish those reports up to the coveralls web service once you've registered an account up there. So it's not straightforward by any means. I've talked about the branching policy already. I'm also giving you a little bit of advice here, which is, once you've made some changes, whether it be to source code or tests or, well, just those two really, don't automatically push it up to GitLab to see, does it work? Make sure everything works locally first. And by that, I mean, I'm telling you that you should build your application locally first using npm run build. Just make sure that there are no errors there. You don't want to get build failure errors in your pipeline because you can resolve those locally first. So run npm build anytime you make any changes, whether it be to your tests or to your source code or to your package.json scripts. Also, let's see, what am I saying? Oh yeah, that's all right. So advising is to typically what the errors that people make. You can also run the built version of your application by just going. Do I say how to do it? Start the build version of the. It runs successfully. Sorry. Oh yeah. Well, to run the build version, the command would be, don't like speaking commands now, but the commands would be node space. If I do it, if I just type it out for you. See, it would be node build, which is the folder that has your build version index.js. Let's see. You may need to set some environment variables, depends. You probably would need to include environment variables before the command, and that depends on whether you're working on Windows or Mac as to how you specify the environment variables. In particular, I guess what you should do is, I presume now you have MongoDB installed locally, so start your MongoDB server locally and then run this command, but set the node env to development and set the MongoDB environment variable to the URL of your local host MongoDB server. So you need to prefix the command that I've just typed there. You need to prefix it with those environment variables. And again, as to how you set the environment variables depends on whether you're working on Windows or Mac, but I presume people know how to set environment variables as part of a command line. That should run your built version of your web API locally, and you could actually just test it manually, either using a browser or using Postman. Just do some basic GET requests. Let's say GET of all movies. So we just want to make sure that our build version of our web API is working at a very basic level. Again, do that before you push up to GitLab. And is there a third one? Well, if you are making changes to your tests, then run your tests locally first. You can run the tests against the source version of the application rather than the build version. So that's just going to be an npm run test. to make sure that all of your tests do pass locally first. And so once you've done all of those three and everything is working fine, then you push up to GitLab. And typically then if GitLab throws an error, one of the stages fails, it tends to be because you haven't set an environment variable up in GitLab for it to work successfully. So avoid headaches and avoid overusing and potentially incurring costs with GitLab by taking these steps every time before you push to GitLab. Right. Where are we time-wise? Gosh. I'll pause for any questions, but I don't know if you have any or not. You may want to read over this and come back to me tomorrow. Now, I don't really have a lab for you tomorrow. We've finished labs at this stage, but I will be available on Slack. And if needs be, I can start up a Zoom session to discuss something in a bit more detail. In the meantime, have a look at the spec. I don't think you need to go any further than that for the next day or two. I will have a look at comparing and contrasting the version of the web API that we had last week versus the version of the web API that you are actually developing in the web app dev, and see how many changes do we need to make to the version that we had last week to get everything back to where it was at the end of last week. In other words, get it working up in the GitLab pipeline. Okay, too much talking. If there's no questions, I'll just pause for a second. No. All right. So I will be available on Slack tomorrow morning if you do have any questions. Thanks. Bye-bye. Now, there's just one item on this set of slides that I didn't cover in the kind of official lecture, and I want to go back to it because it's relevant to the assignment. So if we fast forward through this set of slides right to the end where I had a one talking about testing protected or private routes. In other words, a route which requires the user to be authenticated before they can send requests to it. Now, where that applies in the Movies API, if I go over to VS Code, where's my VS Code? So, and if we go into the Express app itself, which is way down here, then the movies part of the API, which is this part here, it requires or it enforces authentication. Now, what I did say to you in the message that I sent out there yesterday, I think, was I said you could disable the authentication. So I've disabled this line and I've substituted in this one. So that now means that anybody can access the /API/movies endpoint. But at the end of the day, you're going to have to go back and re-enable this and disable that line. So we're faced with the problem of how do we actually implement authentication in our actual test cases. And in the slide, if I guess if we look at the testing code, just before I move away from this. So here's the Movies API testing code. And, you know, for example, here's where we send a GET request to API/movies. But of course, that test is going to throw an exception it's going to fail because the user hasn't authenticated, or to put it in the terms, in the words of HTTP, the request does not include a token in the authentication header accompanying this request. So how do we deal with that? Well, in my slides, I'm saying what you should do is just at the very top of your testing file, just declare a local variable, call it anything, but token would be a sensible name for it. Don't initialize it to anything though. And then have a before each block, where in the before each hook is where you actually send a request to your API, essentially a login request to your API. And in the response that comes back, which we're analyzing here, we're not really concerned with, we can state expectations, okay, but what we're really interested in here is getting at the token that's included in the response that comes back from my login request. And, that's going to be contained within the, it looks like it's contained within the body of the response that comes back. And you can examine the specifics of that in your particular API implementation. It may have changed slightly. I think this screenshot was actually from last year. But either way, in the response that comes back, there will be a token string. And I'm assigning that token string to my local variable that I've declared up here. And now I can use that variable in any request that I send to my movies endpoint. So I guess what I'm saying is, if you take this code here, and put that into, going back to here, maybe make it part of the before each hook that I have here. Add it in other words, add it in here. That means now that, or, you could actually get away with putting it in up here in the before hook, because we only need to log in once. So either or will do, really. So we would declare our token variable up here, and then make our request to our login request either in the before hook, which would mean, stick it in here, or put it into the before each hook, which would mean sticking it in, I guess, here. And in the actual requests that you send to the movies endpoint, then you would need to include a header using the set command. You need to include the authentication header, which would include your authentication token that you've just received from the login request. And that then would allow your request to go right through, it goes through to the actual endpoint itself, to the movies API endpoint, or the API/movies endpoint itself. It would pass the authentication test, if you like. So that's just some guidance on how you'd implement accessing protected or private routes in your API, which you might find useful for the assignment. That's it. Thanks.